All right, here we go. Today is Sunday, October 2nd, 2016, and this is episode 172 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Howdy, Jerry. How are you, sir?
I am really, really good, but about to be very busy. How are you?
The same. You're about to embark on some crazy travel schedule for work, and I'm what is it, 6 days from getting married, so yeah. we both have a busy October afoot.
Absolutely. So congrats, by the way.
Thank you.
And, sorry to all those single ladies now whose hopes have been dashed.
Well, they should have put a finger on it. I mean, a ring on it or something. However that song goes. Darn it. Not enough coffee.
Oh, boy. So,
and you're just back from DerbyCon, which I am sorry I could not make this year, but again, because of the pending nuptials.
Yeah.
But it was a good DerbyCon.
It was a very good DerbyCon. Lots of good talks. Although I will tell you, it was more crowded than I have ever seen it.
Really?
Unlike last year, I tried to actually attend more talks this year, but I really couldn't. Almost everything that I wanted to had they were full by the time I got there.
Yeah.
So, but they're all, by the way, for everybody who's interested, they're online. You can go to the DerbyCon website and watch the videos on YouTube. There's some really good ones. I will at some point. I'm not ready to do that today, but I'll maybe next time I'll talk about the ones I thought were worth watching.
Yes, indeed, because you've got to catch a flight in a couple hours, so we got to do a relatively quick show. But,
that's right.
Maybe when you're on your travels, we'll try to do some remote shows or something and
indeed
pick your brain a little bit on some of the good talks.
Indeed. All right. So before we get started, just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on this show are ours and do not represent those of our employer. And I did have lots of people at DerbyCon come up and ask me, so who does that mean? That was pretty funny.
There's this thing called Google.
I know. It's not really a secret.
And LinkedIn.
It's not really a secret.
Now, who Bob works for, that's a secret.
That is definitely a secret.
Plus, it's rapidly changing these days. But,
yeah.
Anyhow,
the first, this is not really a story. This is comes from the Journal of Cybersecurity on the oxfordjournals.org site.
Which, let me tell you, riveting reading.
Yeah, it's good party fodder. You want to print this thing out and put it on your coffee table.
I may just take it to like a spoken word poetry night and just read it while snapping.
Sounds awesome.
I'm fairly sure the girls' tops will just fly off. And some of the guys, too, I imagine.
Yeah, that's right. I know mine would. Or something. Anyway.
You look for any excuse to get naked, so, whatever.
Well, the llama costume is very hot, so come on. All right, anyhow, the title of the report is Examining the Costs and Causes of Cyber Incidents. So a couple days ago, this was released and was actually, I guess, the 25th of August, so it's been out longer than I thought it was. But most recently, there's been a bunch of discussion because one of the, quote, key findings is that the average cost of a cyber breach is $200,000 as compared to the Ponemon, however many millions of dollars per breach. And so this report's kind of a pretty thorough analytical treatment of breaches that they've gathered from a company that provides consolidated data related to different types of incidents to insurance companies. And so they're careful to go through all of the limitations about the analysis that they perform. For instance, I think they only have cost data on something like 8% of the the incidents that they analyzed, but it's still a pretty big number, and it's clearly not representative of everything that happens. But the point here is that, number one, it's not millions of dollars, like the Ponemon breach says, and number two, it's relatively flat. So unlike the at least the trends of breach instances is not dramatically rising year to year, unlike some of the other reports would say. Now, I think there are some important things to call out, because this again was met with a lot of consternation in the security world.
Well, they also, by name called out Ponemon.
Well, they do
Repeatedly,
over and over and over,
and just the point seems to be to purposefully or legitimately and targetedly counter the cost estimates. But I'm sure you're going to get into this. But one thing I found really interesting was later in the report, where they started talking about trends of optimal cybersecurity spend.
Yes,
and I do have some comments on that, but I'll wait till you get to that section.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, they do kind of nail Ponemon to the wall on this one. I think there's an important distinction, and Ponemon actually does call out one of the limitations of their study is that they're asking key people at certain companies what they believe their costs were, right? So whereas this is, I think, trying to be a little more objective, but at the same time, I think there's some potential big differences, and I'm reminded of remember back in the Kevin Mitnick case back in the 90s when he was being tried. If memory serves right, the government was trying to, I don't know if it was with AT&T or if AT&T was driving this, but they were trying to cover or count the cost of a AT&T building in the losses they incurred as part of his attack, right? And so that I kind of wonder, in the case of Ponemon, let's just get past the fact that it's a subjective open-ended question that they're asking on breach data, or breach costs, I should say. If if you as an organization get breached and you lose a bunch of information, you have remedial costs. You got to go and buy credit monitoring, and you got to hire Mandiant and whatever other kinds of crazy things that need to be done, and that costs money. And then there's the brand damage and that sort of stuff, but brand damage is not included in this particular number. The other thing that I suspect is in the Ponemon number that's not here is the cost to fix whatever systemic problems there were.
Assuming you do.
Assuming you do, right? So if a company's not, let's just say, ridiculous example, right? The company doesn't have firewalls, and they get breached, and it's not hard to think that in the Ponemon scenario, they're going to cover the costs of responding to the breach, but they'll probably also include the cost of putting firewalls in.
Yeah, we did cover a story a couple weeks ago too, where we talked about some of the unrecognized cost of breaches, downstream costs that may or may not be considered in this as well. But
yep.
And on the Kevin Mitnick example, early on in many lawsuits, lawyers will call out any possible cost, no matter how outrageous, to begin the point of negotiation discussion.
Yeah.
So it's rarely representative of reality. It's it's the opening point of legal maneuvering, typically.
Yeah, that's fair. So in this report, they break down the relative frequencies and cost impacts by business segment. So using the NAIC industry code, which was pretty interesting, and you counterintuitively see that retail and health are actually at the bottom in terms of costs, and I think it was mining and insurance are actually at the top. So really interesting. Again, counterintuitive compared to what you or what we would have expected.
Well, what gets covered in the media doesn't necessarily reflect reality of importance.
Well, yeah, exactly right. They do go through, and just this is the math weenie in me. They do go through and they try to model the cost, because they point out that the cost of a breach is in some respects related to the number of records that were breached. However, it's not a linear relationship, and so they actually try to model that, and they talk about some work that Jay Jacobs had done a while ago, and I think this was part of the one of the Verizon data breach investigation reports. And there's a non-linear relationship between number of records and cost, and so they actually try to refine that a little bit. And I'm reminded of I took a really complex physics class a long time ago, and they have this multivariate equation here to model the cost based on the number of employees, the revenue, the number of records lost, whether it was a malicious attack, whether they had that organization had been previously breached, to come up with the expense. And the recollection I have is, if you get beyond 2 or 3 factors, it's probably not right. So
it's really, really tough to estimate this stuff.
So anyway, the real world just doesn't work that way. Anyhow, so there were a couple of key takeaways, I thought. One was, to boil it all out, they find that the average cost of a breach is about 0.4% of revenue, and which, as they point out, is interestingly, through I guess some strange coincidence of math, about the same amount that the average company invests in information security.
So typical company spends about 0.4% of revenue on IT security, and that happens to also be about the average cost of a breach. So there's a correlation there, coincidentally or otherwise, perhaps a wisdom of crowds kind of things, of roughly the average breach is 1 year's IT security budget.
Yeah. Yep. Now, they don't say it directly, but there's kind of an insinuation, both in this report and in some of the discussion that's been around it. Well, what is the optimal amount of spend? And if you're gonna let's say spend 0.4% of your revenue on a breach, and you're also going to spend 0.4% of your revenue on your security program, why not just minimize what you spend on your security program and prepare for the breach? Bank the money. Well, I think one of the challenges there is it kind of negates the whole potential for multiple breaches, for one.
Well, sure.
I mean, kind of simple.
And, one thing they hint at, too, is that if you're going to seek some sort of insurance for cyber liability, there's starting to be a growing consensus among insurers of best practices that will limit your premiums.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, I thought this was a pretty good article, and it, certainly there are some limitations. I think this is a little more rigorous analysis of breach costs than the Ponemon study, and so this might be useful for departments looking to help justify their existence or their investments.
Yeah, I did have some thoughts on that too. That they get into ultimately how much should a firm spend on IT security. So let's say that this particular research becomes standard, and okay, so it becomes commonplace for an organization to say, okay, we're going to spend 0.4% of annual revenues on IT security. But there's far more that goes into it. It goes into what a organization's security looks like than just their security spend. Even if we find the optimal security spend in IT, security being able to sustain or fight off an attack is a much more complex item. It's far more complicated than just how many staff you own and how many blinky boxes you buy, which is in essence what we're talking about when we talk about IT spend is CapEx and OpEx. You could have the same tools, you could have the same number of people, but how you go about doing things is highly variable. It's about how you use those tools, how you configure your systems, how smart and experienced your people are, the culture and risk tolerance of the company. Allowing for different types of controls to be put in place. There's so many security options now built into the average operating systems and such that we utilize. How you configure those matters a great deal. So if you hired a bunch of inexperienced security folks and didn't configure your security gear well, and you're not working hand in hand with your network and system and teams to harden the environment, and you could have the exact same spend, but a much less secure environment.
It's a great point. There's a hidden factor in here, which is like the efficiency of the security spend. Right? Yeah. So there's one dimension is how much money do you spend, and then the other dimension is how effective is the money that you spend. Because it's not hard to imagine a case where one organization, otherwise, all other things more or less being equal. One organization spends a lot less on security, but they may actually be much more secure because they're just better at what they do.
Right.
It's not hard to imagine. So yeah, good point.
The longer I spend in this industry, the more I see the culture of an organization having such a huge impact on these things too. So it's far more than just security spend.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so moving on to our next story. By the way, I like I said, I definitely recommend everybody give that a read. I think if nothing else, it puts, in my mind at least, it puts some more perspective around kind of the macro picture of what we're trying to accomplish, and so that having a handle on that's always a good thing in my view. Mm-hmm. So moving on. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. It does come out of a university environment, so I often take exception with some assumptions that come out of folks in the research world around InfoSec that don't survive in the real world, but this seems fairly valid, but that's just a side rant. So
yeah, well, and just to continue on that thought a little bit, I think that's often the case, but kind of we're going to talk a little bit about this in just a minute, but who else is doing it? Right? That's the problem. Anybody else that
people selling solutions or blinky boxes.
Exactly. Anybody else that's doing this has an agenda and an incentive to either publish the results or not publish the results, whether or not based on whether or not it supports their cause.
Right. I mean, there's probably some valid other groups out there, SANS and aforementioned Pwnymon. Now, they all have their own agendas, right? Nobody is agenda free, including research coming out of organizations like universities.
Well, it's certainly true. All right, moving on to our next story from HelpNetSecurity.com. The title is The Psychological Reasons Behind Risky Password Practices. So I think there's it's a fairly simple article, but basically it's that everybody's terrible at passwords. But depending on the type of personality we have, we internally justify our bad practices in different ways. And so they point out that the type A people, which I'm not even sure that there actually is a type A anymore, but the type A personality, they internally justify, let's say, reusing passwords or using weak passwords, because they believe they're in control, and so they have a system that they've got built into their mind that says I'm gonna reuse the passwords here, and here because I understand the risks, and I'm okay with that. Whereas the type B personality is my stuff just isn't that important. No one would want it. Therefore, I'm going to reuse my passwords. Both of them reuse passwords at a, I guess more or less an equal rate. It's also interesting that they point out in here that 91% of respondents in the survey say that there's inherent risk in reusing passwords, but 61% of them continue to reuse passwords anyway, and half say that they fully understand the risks of doing so, and they.
Well, the implication here is that just because you understand the risk, you're going to stop doing it.
Right.
I think a lot of people make risky decisions every day and just accept the risk inherent in whatever they're doing because the reward is worth it, or the risk is not, the risk consequence is not high enough to care. I mean, how many other times do we see, whether it be drunken driving or we're driving with their seatbelt off, or just picking on driving for a minute, we do risky things. But this could also be a matter of maybe most consumers don't know a better way, or don't feel there is a better way or another option that's worthwhile.
But that therein lies the point of the survey, which was funded by. Wait! LastPass.
Of course.
who will of course help you stop reusing passwords.
Right. Now, to be fair, I am a huge proponent of password managers, and I like LastPass, so I'm not ripping on them. But of course, this goes back to they have a vested interest in pushing people to own and use LastPass, right? But when I'm being honest about it, I think it's one of the only effective ways an average person is going to be able to handle multiple complex passwords.
Yeah, there's this, by the way, this this report online in different forums has really launched just a crap storm of discussion and debate about how passwords just need to die, and the reality is that, and we can all agree probably that multi-factor authentication is a better way to go than passwords. However, we're stuck here living in the real world where
there's always a trade-off. Everything's a trade-off.
Yeah. So
Right.
the point is that at this point in time, passwords are the least common denominator for most things people need to use, and
frankly may be secure enough.
Yeah.
For the average use case. Because here's the problem. When you start pushing more complex mechanisms on consumers, you risk losing customers when they have a choice. It is an inconvenience to them.
Yep.
To have a more complex authentication mechanism. So there is a real competitive issue here. And I think this goes back to some of the stuff Yahoo was arguing, rightly or wrongly, that forcing customers to reset their passwords would perhaps drive attrition of customers.
That's right.
And that's a real risk trade-off that companies have to make.
Indeed. Although, password managers themselves aren't often super simple to use either. So they have a learning curve.
They're not trivial, but they're not insurmountable either, and they're getting better. But yes,
yeah. I guess the point is they're not transparent, and that's one of the challenges. So, and that, by the way, dovetails nicely into the next story, which is from It's from the New York Times, nytimes.com. The title is "Defending Against Hackers Took a Back Seat at Yahoo," insiders say. So we're all probably pretty familiar with some of the history. Back, I think it was during the Aurora attacks, Yahoo was one of the targets, along with Google and others, by the, I guess it's actually the Chinese. I don't know if it's allegedly still or not, but anyhow, a couple years after that, Marissa Mayer became the CEO of Yahoo, and there's kind of post that period, there was some, as portrayed in this article, prioritization discrepancies between what the internal security staff believed needed to be done and what the business was willing to do. So, for instance,
let's stop there for a moment.
Go ahead.
Because that is an incredibly common situation.
Yes.
Right. So, in fact, in almost any organization I've worked in, the security staff has always asked for far more than what management was willing to do. Not to defend Yahoo, but just level setting that first.
And that's the I think that's the challenge is that almost every organization you're going to have this kind of problem, but it only manifests itself as an issue after post breach and people start giving interviews to the New York Times.
Well, it becomes a signal in the noise, right? It's very easy to see
Right.
after the fact the decisions that led to that problem.
That's exactly right. Good analogy. Good book too, by the way.
Yeah. But now, let me be very clear. I'm not defending Yahoo's decision making as we get into this article.
So at some point they hired Alex Stamos, and I remember this. And at the time when they hired Alex to be the CISO of Yahoo, there was a lot of fanfare saying, Yahoo finally gets it, and they understand. And this, I think a lot of the impetus behind them hiring Alex was after the Snowden leaks. And they mentioned that in the article too. That Yahoo was a pretty key surveillance target by the NSA, and so there were concerns about the blowback of worldwide users. So they hired Alex, who was a very, very, very intelligent person and a huge privacy rights advocate. And he went, apparently, reading through this article, this a lot of the stuff is things I hadn't heard before. He tried to drive lots of change, and I guess some of it was sticky, right? So they changed their SDLC and imparted better security practices throughout the company. But there were key programs that Alex apparently put forward that were just not accepted, and one of the most notable, as it now turns out, as far as I can tell, and this is still a little murky to me, a couple of years ago they were breached and they had 500 million user accounts stolen. So
perhaps up to 1 billion user accounts by some accounts.
The new scuttle is that it could be up to 1 billion.
Yeah.
That's new news since this article was written. But
correct.
But that happened a couple of years ago, and I guess they knew about it, right? And they didn't disclose that fact. And apparently there was discussions at the time about forcing a password change. And that password change was rejected. And so there's a lot of hoopla going on. As I understand it, there's a couple of class action lawsuits, and there are now legislators calling for the SEC to investigate Yahoo's quarterly, or I guess it's quarterly or annual, their official filings, which per SEC rules are now supposed to disclose any kind of material breach. And obviously, since this is news, that hasn't happened. So the timing of when Yahoo became aware of this is still not clear in my mind.
There's a lot of competing versions of that information right now as to when they knew about it.
But I guess throughout the story, another item that was proposed and not adopted was spending $10 million on encryption technology. Let's see. I think those were that.
That is something they did do.
They did do that, right? It was the IPSs. It was
right.
That's right. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, and so within the context of the organization, the trade-off was that Yahoo was bleeding users and shrinking rapidly their user base, and they really felt that forcing all of their users to do a password reset was going to drive greater attrition of their user base. Now, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's a decision they made. And the reason I point that out is that every organization has competing priorities like this. And every organization has limited resources and goodwill with their users, and how they're going to spend it is up to them. And sometimes they make the wrong call, and sometimes they make the right call. But often it's not necessarily the same opinion of the security team. And that's a really difficult position to be in as security folks. And I'm not defending Yahoo. I'm not saying they made the right call, but I'm saying there's a lot of times our recommendations don't get followed up on. They go unheeded.
Well, this is a tough business challenge, and I think it's also, it in some respects comes down to the ability of, whether it's the CIO or the CISO, whoever, to put the investment that's required for security in the context of business terms, right? Because if you're going to spend $10 on security, that means you're not spending $10 on building your product, or you're not sending that $10 back to your shareholders. So the $10 has to come from somewhere. It doesn't magically appear out of nowhere, and so the business leadership, who are not generally security experts, have to, in the context of business terms, kind of put it all on the table and say, where is the most sensible place to put this money? And I think one of the challenges is when you read this story here, is that not only was there investment required in a company who had declining revenues and declining user base, not a great time to be asking for implementing new security stuff. It also potentially had the net effect of making things more, or I should say, less user friendly, which could potentially have accelerated the decline of the user base. And there's been some other stories that, not in this one, but that kind of juxtapose Google's approach to this, where they've kind of, whether or not you agree with this, right? They've kind of taken the approach of security as a differentiator, whereas in the case of Yahoo, they seem to have taken the approach that security is a potential inhibitor to customer satisfaction.
And the wonderful thing about the free market is now people get to choose.
Yeah,
if they truly care about that issue.
That's right.
And I think the other takeaway is that we, as security people, have to understand the culture of the organizations we're working in and realize what we can and cannot do in those cultures. Like looking at a university environment, IT security folks in a university environment usually have to maintain a very, very, very open student network.
Right.
They can't be throwing in firewalls and IPSs and web proxy filters. It's just not that culture. But there's other things they can do, but they have to know what it is they can do within the organizational culture. And so, all that being said, hiring somebody like Alex is a great thing, but unless they empower that, or that they're, he's a known quantity with very strong views, it was almost like a PR stunt, it looks like, because they weren't willing to change the culture to follow those recommendations. And not saying that the company should change for the CISO, but if you hire a CISO and then don't agree with his recommendations, especially with someone who has a known track record of these sorts of things, it seems, I don't know, a little smoke and mirrors to me. But at the same time, a CISO also can't expect the organization to exactly match their views. They've got to adapt to the board and the executive viewpoint of what the culture needs to be.
Right. They need to help form a strategy that meshes with the business's strategy. We don't know all of the details,
lawyer, right?
Yeah.
A lawyer doesn't tell business how to do its job. A lawyer keeps it legal as best they can.
Right.
So we in security rarely can tell business how to do its job, but we can try to keep it safe.
Good point. So anyhow, interesting. I do agree with you, though, that in hindsight, the hiring of Alex by Yahoo seems like it was kind of a direct reaction to helping stem the tide of fleeing people from their customers, from their products. So I guess they're really not their customers, are they? They're their users. Customers are the advertisers. Anyway.
Good point.
Anyway, moving on. This is the final story, which is also about Yahoo. I thought this was good, and in particular because it satiates my need for confirmation bias, right? Which the title here is Yahoo Breach: The Great Nation State Cop Out. Shortly after the breach was announced, the CEO, or the CISO, I should say, announced that apparently this was the alleged work of nation state hackers, or hackers who were supported by a nation state. And so the point of this article, and this is something that I have railed on quite a lot, is that there's so much incentive, or all the way around, to blame nation states, right? When in the point here, and Jeffrey Carr has a great quote in here. Nobody should believe anybody who blames a breach on a nation state. And no one should want to do that, except for CEOs, because they have a direct incentive and benefit from doing so. Because no one wants to get up in front of reporters and say, "Yeah, we were breached by," as Donald Trump would say, the 400-pound hacker in mom's basement. Which
the breach was huge breach,
huge breach,
and Mexico paid for it.
We should just build a wall.
A big cyber wall.
And make Russia pay for it. Anyway, back on track.
And don't forget Mr. Kevin Mandia with his infamous letter to Sony.
That's right. So, I think everybody all the way around is incentivized to blame nation states. From the perspective of a company like Yahoo, it's a whole lot more palatable to say, it was Russian state-sponsored, or the Russian military hackers who did this. Because if you say that, and that is in fact what happened, there's probably little you could actually do, right? Because if you're the focused target of some major world powers military or intelligence agency, you're probably not going to defend it for long. I mean, you could probably slow them down a little. But ultimately, you're going to lose your secrets. The thing that's really odd here is, to what end?
Right.
So, what possible use does a Russian military group have with, or a Russian intelligence agency have with penetrating Yahoo, gathering all this data and then dumping it on the internet? I don't know.
But doesn't mean it wasn't them. But
it does not mean it wasn't done. That's right.
But it goes back to the point of, we have always been incredibly skeptical of nation-state attribution on this show, because it's not that unique, right? This is not like a space program. I mean, these are things that small individual groups or even individuals could do. It doesn't have to be funded by a massive organization like a government. It really doesn't.
Yep, that's right.
So, and we've covered ad nauseum how the individual markers of attribution are easily misunderstood and forged. It's I'm always very, very, very skeptical of attribution, and of course, to counter that as well, the government has visibility into things you don't. Well, it's also in the government's interest to say that it was another government who did this, because guess what? It ups their budget.
Well, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true.
But here's the funny part. At the end of the day, I don't know that attribution is, at least for our level, in defending our organizations and the blue teaming that we need to do, attribution is the last thing I usually care about. Doesn't matter who did it. I still need to stop it. Best I can.
Yeah, there's a lot of this is an area of a lot of contention. I think there was a talk at DerbyCon about the need for attribution. I want to say, maybe I'm misremembering. I saw something recently about the importance of attribution. I tend to think that you're right. for the most part, we're dealing with ransomware, and it doesn't matter if your ransomware came from the Ukraine or Russia or Idaho. Probably not. So anyway, I think that for the most part, most organizations don't have the maturity in their security program where worrying about attribution is really all that beneficial. I do think that, as we see here, attribution has a benefit in terms of messaging post breach, though, and that's the whole point of this.
Then it becomes a PR war,
right? Because look, we were Yahoo. We're Yahoo. We got breached by the Russians, and really nothing we could have done. Yeah, we at least our passwords were encrypted.
Right. So don't sue us. Right? It wasn't us. It was Russia. Nobody can fight Russia.
Right.
Or North Korea.
Oh yeah. So anyway, this is the show for this week. Thank you everyone for listening. And it's over the next couple of weeks will be probably a little intermittent. We will try to get shows out as we can. Thank you again to all of our Patreon donors. So amazed that you support the show. That's really very, very much appreciated. You can find links to all the stories we talked about today on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can follow the show on Twitter at DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Kala on Twitter at Lurg and me on Twitter at MaliciousLink. And I guess before we go, we should talk a little bit about the whole Ignite thing, which I believe the CFP is closed now for.
CFP is closed. Yeah, now you and I got to pick.
We got to go vote. Yep. That should be fun.
So, and that's for the O'Reilly Security Conference in New York, October 31st Ignite session that Jerry and I are hosting. That's right.
Should be fun. Be there, be square. By the way, the conference looks to be really good. So if you can get out there, I'd recommend it. It's very much a blue team focused conference, so that is a little different thing.
Yeah, right up our alley.
Anyway, thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll talk again later. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.